Welcome to Handmade Happenings. I'm Marissa, and today I'm making a Christmas project using my favorite little boys pattern, which is the Children's Corner Basic for Boys pattern, View A, which of course is the view with the smocked insert on the shirt. And then this outfit is finished off with a pair of button-on shorts. I've made this pattern several times before, so I will be sharing some tips as I go, but this isn't really an in-depth tutorial. So first off, as always, is cutting out the fabric. For the shirt, I used a basic white quilting cotton, I think it was, and I started out by cutting out a strip of fabric for the pleated insert. And I just cut it the full width of the fabric and then trimmed it down to the size I needed, which is 3 times the width of the insert template that came with the pattern. Then just cut out the remaining pieces, which are the shirt front, 2 front yokes, 2 shirt backs, 2 sleeves, 4 collars, and the neckline facing, which I actually already had one cut out from the last time I did it, and just used that instead. For the shorts, I used a burgundy broadcloth. The pattern has 2 pieces. It's the front and back piece, and it calls for 4 of each piece, and that's 2 of each piece for the outside of the shorts, like the main part, and then 2 for the lining. Now, normally I prefer to cut the lining out of the same fabric as the outside of the shorts, but I misread my pattern and did not have enough of that fabric to do that, so I just lined it with the same white fabric that I used on the shirt. And since that is the case, then I made sure that I actually followed the directions and trimmed 1/4 inch off the hem of the lining fabric of the shorts, which you'll see why later when I put it together. This pattern has a lot of pleats and pieces that need to be folded up and pressed into place, and to mark those, what I do is I just cut a little snip at the edge of the fabric right where those lines are, and this is actually also how I mark the edges of darts. And then the shirt has a lot of buttons that go around the waist. These are for the shorts to attach to, and I just mark those locations using thread tacks. And the last thing I cut out was strips of red fabric for the corded piping. These are all technically supposed to be cut on the bias, but I only really worry about that for the parts that are going to need to bend around a curve, which is mainly the pieces that are going on the collar. For the rest of it, they're going to be straight. I just cut straight strips because it's a more efficient use of my fabric. And after cutting everything out, I go back to the ironing board to iron everything again. As wrinkly as my fabric always looks, you would never believe that I actually do iron it all before I go to cut out my pieces. But always still ends up looking really wrinkly, so I always go over all the pieces again after they've been cut out. This is also when I take the time to press up anything that has folds in it. So like in this case, the hem of the sleeve, as well as the facing on the back facing of the shirt, and all of those pleats that are on the shirt front. After pressing everything, I take my smocking insert and run it through my pleater. Now, I actually managed to break a pleater needle doing this because I think that fabric that I was using was thicker than what I would normally use. It was something I had already on hand. So after it goes through the pleater, I tie off the insert to the size that I need based on that template from the pattern. And then I even out the pleats and run some steam over it. And now for the fun part, the smocking. I chose the Jamie smocking plate by Ellen McCann. This is my favorite smocking plate to use for both boys and girls clothes. It's a 2-color pattern, and I used a burgundy and dark green flush. Flush, if you're wondering, is a type of embroidery thread. It's softer and thinner than the embroidery floss that you typically see in the stores. I happen to have a lot of it, so I'm just trying to use it up. When the smocking was done, I steamed the piece again to block it, and then I pinned these templates that show the shape of the armhole, because you have to cut that curve. But first, I have to carefully stitch around that curve with a short, narrow zigzag stitch, trying to get as close to that template that I pinned on as possible without actually sewing into it. Then remove the templates and carefully cut on the outside of the stitching. And don't worry about the smocking, the stitches that I sewed on the machine hold that in place. I then press strips of freezer paper with the shiny side down onto the top and bottom of the insert. That holds the pleats in place when stitching on them. Now the insert is ready, but I still need to prepare the piping. I take those strips of red fabric from earlier and fold them in half with yarn, around yarn. I then sew it using a zipper foot to get as close to the yarn, which I'm using as cord, as possible. I then trim the edges to the necessary width using this Tin Sisters piping tool. Basically, you fit the cord into a slot, which each slot is marked for the size that you need, and then run your rotary cutter along the edge. For most of my pieces, I needed a 1/4 inch. There was one piece that needed to be a 1/2 inch. The size is based on the seam allowance of the seam that it's being attached to. And believe it or not, that was all just the prep work. Now it's time to actually assemble this. So I start out by taking the pleated insert and placing a piece of piping. This is one of the ones with the 1/2 inch edge, and lining that raw edge of the piping up with the raw edge of the top of the insert. I then sandwich the insert and the piping in between the two yoke pieces. Again, matching up all those raw edges with the top. And sew through all of those layers. I used the zipper foot again for both here and any other time that I'm attaching piping. Again, so I can just get as close to the piping, the corded piping as possible. So at some point, I basted the pleats of the shirt front in place. And now I'm just attaching that to the bottom of the smocked insert, again sandwiching corded piping in between. And for some reason, my shirt front piece ended up wider than the bottom of the smocked insert. I'm not really sure what happened, but since it didn't look really uneven, like the pleats didn't look uneven, I just trimmed the excess off and left it. And after those seams are sewn is when I did remove the freezer paper. If you try this with anything smocked, don't rip it off, just kind of gently tail it off from either side, because you don't want to like damage your stitches if you pull too hard. To attach the shirt back to the shirt front, I place them right sides together and pin them at the shoulder seams, but I only pin the back pieces to the yoke, the outer yoke. The lining yoke doesn't get pinned to it yet. I then roll up the shirt from the hem all the way up and pull that lining piece around all of that that's been rolled up, and then pin it to the shoulder seams. And what this gives is the shirt back shoulder seams should be sandwiched between the shirt front yoke shoulder seams. And then just stitch those seams and pull everything out through the neckline so that it lays flat again. To make the collars, I started by taking piping and pinning along the outer curved edge of a collar piece, and then sandwiched another one on top and sewed around that edge. Flipped it right sides out, pressed it, and top stitched it, and then repeated for the other one. Then I pinned the collar to the shirt. They ideally they should meet in the middle once they're sewn, And to help with that, what I like to do is just overlap the piping slightly at the center. That way, once it's sewn, it usually either meets in the center or just overlaps slightly. I avoid having like a big gap in between the collars. Anyway, pin the collars in place, but before they can be sewn, I take that back facing, which I had pressed back earlier when I pressed all of my pieces after cutting them out, and I flip it so that it is right sides together and pin that in place. Then on top of that, I add the neckline facing all the way around the neckline. Now I can sew it through all of those layers. Then I clip the curves and flip everything back to the wrong sides, other than the collar, obviously. And I use a whip stitch to sew down the neckline facing. Okay, so next are the sleeves. So this pattern has kind of like a cuff, and I've already pressed in the hem of the sleeve. But normally you would think that that piece would go on the inside of the shirt, but in this case it actually goes on the outside because you attach piping to the hem and then you fold that raw edge under to get a neat edge, which you then stitch down. After that, I attach the sleeves to the shirt. So with the sleeves in, it's finally time to pretty much finish this by sewing the side seams and then pressing up and sewing the hem of the shirt. And if you're wondering, I do serge all of the raw edges that aren't like enclosed or encased in seams. I just don't show it or mention it necessarily in videos because it gets kind of repetitive. So then this shirt closes in the back with buttons. And so I sew the buttonholes on the back with my sewing machine and then sew the small buttons along the opposite side of the back. And then this shirt also has 6 larger buttons that are sewn around the waist because that's how the shorts attach to the shirt. And this is where you really know that I must like this pattern because I keep making it in spite of all of these buttons and buttonholes that have to be done. All right, the shirt is finally done and now it's time for the shorts. So the back pieces have darts, so I went ahead and started by sewing those darts on all of the back pieces, both the main pieces and the lining pieces. And in fact, the next several steps all apply to both the main and lining pieces, so I'm going to throw that out there now instead of continuing to repeat myself. Now place the front pieces right sides together and sew along that crotch seam, repeating for the back pieces as well. Now on the back lining pieces, I do leave a gap, which is for toning the fabric the shorts right side out later on. Now put the front and back pieces right sides together and sew along those side seams. Now this doesn't go like straight up because the top of the shorts have to be left open for putting them on and off. So I clipped a notch in the fabric right where the stitching stops, which is of course marked on the pattern. So now put the lining and the main fabrics right sides together. I usually have the main fabric on the outside and the lining fabric tucked into the inside of the main fabric. And you're going to sew them together starting on the side, right where that side seam stitching ends. Sew up and then turn your fabric, sew across the top and turn and sew back down. And that's on the front, and then you repeat for the back as well. And then flip it right sides out. There's always a few curves that need clipped because for me at least, I never quite get it right. So I'm always clipping curves to try and get it to lay as flat as possible. Now for the pant hem. So when I flip everything right back to right side out, I make sure those pant hems and everything for the outside and lining are lined up so that I have the correct ones. And then I grab the outer and lining fabrics of one of the pant legs and pull them apart and wrap them around all of the rest of the shorts. And then place those pant seams or hems right side together and stitch along that edge before pulling it out through whatever hole I can find to put them right sides out. So basically similar to when the seam was sandwiched for the shoulder seams on the shirt, when everything is pulled together, you'll know it's right if you can't really see the rest of the shorts, because they should all be stuffed inside in between the pant leg and like the outer pant leg and the lining. And because the lining was trimmed down at the beginning, now you can see how the main fabric kind of rolls under so that you don't see the lining at all at the hem. And then I just repeat again for the other leg. Okay, now for the inseam, and I hope the video is clear for both the last step and this step because they are really hard to explain. So find the hole left on the back lining and pull both of the inseams through it. And then line up the inseams right sides together and pin them in place, lining up the appropriate seams as you go. And then sew that seam, which should be like one really tight circle that's going to go all the way around. Sew that seam and then pull the inseam back out of the hole. And then I close the hole using a whip stitch. And lastly is sewing the buttonholes onto the shorts. Again, I just use my sewing machine for this. And there's like 8 of them. So it's a lot of buttonholes, like I said. And now it's done. To attach the shorts to the shirt, I just slide the shirt into the inside of the shorts and do up the buttons. I always start at the back because those side buttonholes overlap. Like there's one on the side of the front and one on the side of the back, and you put them both onto the same button and the front goes over top of the back. Thank you for watching. I hope it inspired you to do some last minute holiday sewing, and I hope you will join me next week for another handmade happening.